The only problem I have with Tony Gwynn, he's the type of player that he should have been playing where Derek Jeter plays, or he should have been playing in L.A., a big market, because baseball fans should have saw more of Tony Gwynn.
It's sad to see him go because, what he's done for the game, what he's done for, San Diego, but, his family is really tight. I know Tony Gwynn Jr. played with him for a little bit. So, to me, it's a tough loss for friendship and that, but just for San Diego in general and for the game of baseball. He's going to be missed.
The tragic truth about Tony Gwynn's death in 2014 is not what you were told. The public story was incomplete. What got buried was a web of corporate deception, organizational silence, and media misdirection that turned one of baseball's greatest careers into a case study in systemic failure. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. Tony Gwynn was Mr. Padre, 8 batting titles, a career average of 338, a smile that could light up a stadium. He was the kind of player who made the game look easy and the kind of man who made everyone around him feel valued. When he died on the 16th of June 2014, the sports world mourned a legend. But what most people did not see was the truth behind his decline. The real story was not about age or weight or simple bad luck. It was about 3 deliberate lies that shaped the final chapter of his life. The first lie came from the tobacco industry, which convinced him that their product was a safe alternative and then watched as it destroyed him from the inside out. The second lie came from his own team, the San Diego Padres, who buried a racist attack in their clubhouse to protect their image. The third lie came from the media, who turned his medical crisis into a punchline about his weight. If you want this story to reach more people who need to hear it, hit that hype button right now. Let's make sure the truth does not get buried again. This is not a gossip piece. This is an investigation. We are going to walk through the medical reality that the public never fully understood, the corporate strategy that targeted him before he even knew the risks, the clubhouse incident that nearly drove him away from baseball, and the media circus that distracted everyone from what was really happening. By the end, you will see how all 3 lies came together to create a tragedy that could have been prevented. Let's start with what actually killed Tony Gwynn. The official cause of death was complications from salivary gland cancer. More specifically, it was a malignant tumor in his parotid gland. The parotid gland is one of the largest salivary glands in your body. It sits in your cheek area, right in front of your ears. For most people, that gland does its job quietly and never causes a problem. It produces saliva to help you chew and digest food. It sits there for your entire life without incident. But for Tony Gwynn, that gland became ground zero for a battle he could not win. The reason it mattered so much was simple and horrifying. That cheek area, that exact spot where the parotid gland sits, was the same place Tony held his smokeless tobacco for more than 30 years. Every single day for decades, he was packing tobacco into that same location. The tissue was being exposed to the chemicals over and over again. He called himself a tobacco junkie. He was open about it. He did not try to hide the habit or downplay it. The addiction started when he was a college athlete at San Diego State University in the late 1970s. Back then, it seemed harmless. It was just part of the culture. Lots of players used it. Coaches did not discourage it. Teammates passed it around. It was as normal as wearing a glove or swinging a bat. But over the decades, the constant exposure built up in that one spot. The biological damage was accumulating even when Tony felt perfectly healthy. The tumor formed right where he had been holding dip day after day, year after year. That connection was not a coincidence. It was a direct biological consequence. The location of the tumor matched the location of the habit with terrifying precision. During his playing career, Tony had noticed benign growths on the right side of his mouth. Doctors kept an eye on them, but they were not dangerous at the time. They were just bumps. Annoying but not life-threatening. The doctors would check them regularly and tell him to come back if anything changed. For years, nothing changed. Then, in August 2010, everything changed. Tony went in for a routine check and the doctors decided to do a biopsy on one of the growths. The biopsy came back and confirmed that a new growth was malignant. The cancer was real, and it was in the worst possible location. This was not skin cancer or something that could be treated with a simple removal. This was a malignant tumor sitting deep in the tissue of his face, right next to some of the most sensitive and important structures in the human body. On the 31st of August 2010, Tony underwent his first major surgery to remove the primary mass from his right cheek. The surgeons went in with the goal of taking out all of the cancer and giving Tony a clean bill of health. But there was a major problem. The tumor was sitting right next to his facial nerve. That nerve is not just one strand. It is a complex network of branches that controls all the muscles in your face. It lets you smile, blink, close your mouth, show emotion, chew food, speak clearly. If the surgeons cut too deep and damaged that nerve, Tony would be left with permanent facial paralysis on one side. His face would droop. He would not be able to close his eye, which could lead to blindness. He would not be able to smile or frown. He would lose lose the ability to communicate with his expressions, which for someone as warm and charismatic as Tony was a devastating prospect. So the surgeons made a calculated decision. They removed as much of the tumor as they could without touching the nerve, but they left small remnants behind. Tiny pieces of malignant tissue that were too close to the nerve to safely remove. The plan was to use radiation and chemotherapy after the surgery to kill off whatever was left. It was a gamble, but it seemed like the best option at the time. The alternative was to go for complete removal and leave Tony with a paralyzed face for the rest of his life. They chose to bet on the treatments. Unfortunately, that gamble did not pay off. The radiation and chemo worked for a while. Tony went through the treatments and the scans came back clean. He was able to get back to his life. He was coaching at San Diego State. He was spending time with his family. He thought he had beaten it, but by early 2012, the cancer came back. This time, it was worse. The tumor had returned and it had grown into the facial nerve itself. The cancer cells were intertwined with the nerve tissue, wrapping around it like a vine. That meant there was no way to remove the cancer without removing the nerve. There was no more room for a conservative approach. Tony was facing a nightmare scenario. If he did nothing, the cancer would keep spreading. It would eventually reach other parts of his head and neck. It would become untreatable. But if he went ahead with the surgery, he would lose the ability to move the right side of his face. There was no good option. There was only the option that gave him the best chance of survival. On the 14th of February 2012, Tony went into surgery at UC San Diego's Thornton Hospital. The operation lasted 14 hours. 14 hours. Let that sink in. Most people have never been under anesthesia for more than a few hours. Tony was on that operating table for more than half a day. The surgical team had to work in 3 separate stages because the procedure was so complex. First, they had to remove the entire tumor and all the surrounding scar tissue from the previous surgery. That was stage 1. It involved cutting into the cheek area, peeling back layers of tissue, and carefully excising every piece of malignant growth they could find. They also had to remove the scar tissue from the 2010 surgery because scar tissue can sometimes hide cancer cells. Then came stage 2, which was the most delicate and terrifying part. Dr. Jeffrey Harris had to completely remove Tony's right facial nerve to make sure no cancer cells were left behind. He had to cut the nerve away from the tissue, severing the connection between Tony's brain and the muscles in his face. But they could not just leave him with a dead nerve. If they did that, the paralysis would be permanent with no hope of recovery. So Dr. Harris performed what is called a nerve graft. He took a donor nerve from Tony's shoulder and neck area, a nerve that controlled sensation and movement in his arm. He harvested a section of that nerve and carefully sutured it to the remaining branches of the facial nerve near Tony's ear. The idea was that the nerve would act as a bridge. Over time, the facial nerve branches would grow along the graft, slowly reconnecting to the muscles. The hope was that Tony would regain some movement, but that process was going to take at least 18 months. 18 months of waiting to see if the surgery worked, 18 months of living with a paralyzed face. Stage 3 was about reconstruction. The surgeons had to rebuild the cheek area and close up the massive surgical site. They had removed so much tissue that there was a hole in Tony's face. They had to use grafts and flaps to fill in the space and create a surface that could heal. When Tony woke up from that operation, he could not smile. He could not fully close his right eye. He could not close his mouth properly. His face was swollen and bandaged. He was in pain, and he had no idea if he would ever be able to show emotion again. For a man whose whole identity was built on warmth and presence, on being the friendly face of the Padres, this was devastating. Think about what that means on a practical level. Every time Tony looked in the mirror, he saw a stranger. Every time he tried to smile, nothing happened. Every time he tried to talk, his words came out slurred because he could not move half of his mouth. He had to tape his eyes shut at night to keep it from drying out because he could not blink. The physical recovery was brutal. He had to wait for those nerve branches to slowly regrow millimeter by millimeter, hoping that eventually he would be able to show emotion again. There was no guarantee it would work. The doctors told him it might take 18 months, but they also told him he might never fully recover. He might regain some movement, or he might not. It was a waiting game. And through all of that, Tony kept showing up. He kept coaching. He kept mentoring young players. He did not hide from the world. He faced it with the same grace he had always shown. This was not just a medical procedure. It was a fight to reclaim a piece of his humanity. Now let's talk about how Tony ended up in that situation in the first place. This is where the tobacco industry enters the story, and this is where the lies get dark. This is where corporate greed meets human suffering. Tony Gwynn did not just randomly decide to start using smokeless tobacco one day. He did not wake up and think it would be a fun hobby. He was targeted. He was part of a specific demographic that the tobacco industry identified as profitable and vulnerable. In 2016, 2 years after his death, his widow Alicia and their children filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Altria Group and the U.S. Smokeless Tobacco Company. The lawsuit made a serious accusation. It claimed that the tobacco industry had tricked Tony into a lifelong addiction before health warnings warnings were even required by law. This was not about Tony making a bad choice. This was about a corporation deliberately creating addiction in young people before they were legally required to tell the truth about the risks. Let me explain what that means and why it matters. Before 1987, smokeless tobacco products in the United States did not have to carry warning labels. There was no requirement to tell consumers that using these products could cause cancer. There was no legal obligation to disclose the health risks. The industry was operating in a regulatory gap where they could say whatever they wanted and sell whatever they wanted without consequences. They took full advantage of that gap. They marketed smokeless tobacco as a healthier alternative to smoking cigarettes. They ran advertisements showing rugged men using dip as a safe way to get their nicotine fix. The message was clear. If you are worried about lung cancer from smoking, switch to dip. It is safer, it is cleaner, it is smarter, except it was not safer. It just caused a different kind of cancer. It caused tumors in the mouth, throat, and salivary glands instead of in the lungs, and the industry knew that. Internal research showed the risks, but they kept that research hidden from the public. Internal documents from tobacco companies reveal a strategy that started in the 1960s and ramped up over the following decades. They called it the African Americanization of their products. The industry recognized that African American consumers represented a huge market opportunity. They saw growing purchasing power in black communities and they wanted to capture it. So they tailored their marketing to appeal specifically to black identity and culture. They flooded black newspapers and magazines like Ebony and Jet with advertisements. By the mid-1980s, tobacco companies were responsible for up to 60% of the advertising revenue in some of those publications. They used models with afros and natural hairstyles. They created slogans that referenced soul style and black pride. They even tied their products to the civil rights movement and the Black Power era. It was cultural appropriation designed to sell addiction. But it went deeper than just advertisements. The tobacco industry provided massive financial sponsorships to major African American organizations. The NAACP, the National Urban League, the United Negro College Fund, these were institutions that served the black community, and the tobacco companies were their biggest donors. That created a complicated dynamic. How do you speak out against an industry that is funding your operations? The result was silence. The health risks were downplayed or ignored because the money was too important to lose. Tony Gwynn fit perfectly into this strategy. He was a young black athlete in the late 1970s, playing baseball and basketball at San Diego State. According to the lawsuit, tobacco industry representatives were actively targeting college athletes during that time. They would show up at athletic facilities and hand out free samples. The goal was simple: get young men addicted before they fully understood the risks. By the time Tony reached the major leagues, his habit had already taken hold. He was using 1.5 to 2 cans of dip every single day. That level of consumption was not normal. It was the result of a biological addiction that had been carefully cultivated. The industry's defense in cases like this always follows the same script. They argue that the person was a sophisticated consumer who made an informed choice. They say that by the time warning labels were required in 1987, everyone knew the risks. But that argument ignores the timeline. Tony started using smokeless tobacco in the late 1970s, almost a decade before warnings were mandated. And even after the warnings appeared, they were vague. They mentioned cancer in general terms, but they did not specifically call out the risk of parotid gland cancer or salivary gland tumors. The industry marketed smokeless tobacco as hip, cool, and safe. They targeted young black men like Tony and built a customer base that was chemically dependent before the law required them to tell the truth. The lawsuit also pointed to another layer of deception. The tobacco companies allegedly concealed research showing the direct link between smokeless tobacco and salivary gland cancer. They knew their product was causing these specific tumors, but they did not make that information public. Instead, they continued to promote dip as a healthier option. Tony Gwynn used to joke that he was a tobacco junkie, but the reality was not funny. He was the victim of a corporate scheme that prioritized profit over human life. The lawsuit eventually settled in 2018 through a confidential agreement. That means the full details of what the industry knew and when they knew it will probably never be made public. Confidential settlements protect the companies from having to face a public trial where internal documents might be exposed. It is a common tactic, and it works. But even without a trial, the lawsuit achieved something important. It forced the conversation about smokeless tobacco into the open. It connected the dots between corporate behavior and individual suffering, and it contributed to a cultural shift in Major League Baseball. In 2016, the league banned smokeless tobacco for all new players entering the sport. That rule change happened because people like Tony Gwynn paid the price for the industry's lies. Now we need to address the second major lie, and this one came from inside Tony's own organization. The San Diego Padres have spent decades building an image of Tony Tony Gwynn as the ultimate loyal player, the man who stayed with one team for his entire career and became the face of the franchise. That narrative is true on the surface, but it hides a much darker reality. In 1990, Tony Gwynn almost walked away from the Padres, not because of money, not because he wanted to chase a championship somewhere else. He almost left because of a racist attack that happened in his own clubhouse, and the team chose to cover it up rather than hold anyone accountable. The tension started with his teammate Jack Clark. Clark was a power hitter who played first base. He had a very different approach to the game than Tony. Clark believed in swinging for the fences and driving in runs. Tony's game was built on contact hitting and batting for average. That philosophical difference turned into a public feud. Jack Clark went to the media and accused Tony of being a selfish player. He said that Tony only cared about winning batting titles and padding his stats. He claimed that while Tony was collecting individual honors, the team was finishing 4th or 5th in the standings every year. Other teammates, including Gary Templeton, echoed those criticisms. Tony was being painted as the reason the Padres were not winning, even though his offensive production was elite. The clubhouse became fractured. Instead of supporting their best player, some of the team turned against him. Then the situation escalated into something far worse. Tony walked into the Padres dugout one day and found one of his promotional figurines hanging from the ceiling. The figurine had a noose around its neck. Its arms and feet had been removed. It was a mock lynching. Let me be clear about what that means. A lynching is not just a method of execution, it is a symbol of racial terror. For more than a century, black people in America were lynched as a form of intimidation and control. Hanging a black man in effigy is not a prank, it is a hate crime. Someone in that clubhouse wanted to send Tony a message, and the message was about race. The Padres organization had a choice. They could investigate the incident, identify the person responsible, and hold them accountable, or they could sweep it under the rug to avoid a scandal. They chose the second option. The team's management publicly blamed an anonymous groundskeeper for the incident. They said it was a maintenance worker who had access to the dugout and must have done it as some kind of misguided joke. But that story did not hold up. The dugout is not a public area. It is a high-security space that only players, coaches, and a few trusted staff can access. Everyone in the clubhouse knew that a player was responsible. The two main suspects were Jack Clark, who had been publicly feuding with Tony, and Eric Sho, a pitcher who was a known member of the John Birch Society, a far-right political organization with a history of racist rhetoric. Despite the obvious signs that one of his teammates was behind the attack, the Padres refused to name anyone. Instead, they promised Tony that the groundskeeper would apologize to him personally. That apology never came, because there was no groundskeeper. The whole thing was a lie designed to protect the roster and avoid bad publicity. Tony was devastated. This was not just about baseball, it was about his safety and his dignity. He was being targeted for his race in a place where he should have been supported and protected, and the organization he had given everything to was more interested in maintaining harmony than in standing up for him. Tony missed the final 19 games of the 1,990 season. The official explanation was that he had broken his index finger and needed time to recover. But privately, he admitted that he needed to get away from the clubhouse. He needed distance from the toxic environment and the media circus that was swirling around the incident. The fact that Tony eventually decided to stay with the Padres for his entire career is often celebrated as loyalty, but it also represents an enormous psychological burden. He chose to keep playing for a team that had failed him in the most fundamental way. He became Mr. Padre despite the fact that the Padres organization had allowed him to be racially intimidated without consequences. That is not loyalty, that is resilience. And it came at a cost that most fans will never fully understand. The third lie is the one that happened in plain sight. Throughout the second half of his career and into his coaching years, Tony Gwynn was constantly criticized for his weight. Sports media loved to make jokes about his body. They called him husky. They questioned his conditioning. They suggested that if he just lost a few pounds, he would be even better. This narrative became so dominant that it overshadowed the real medical crisis Tony was facing. Let's be clear about the facts. Tony Gwynn was a big guy. He was listed at 6 feet tall and well over 200 pounds for most of his career. He did not have the lean, sculpted look that people associate with elite athletes. But his weight did not stop him from being one of the greatest hitters in baseball history. In his 2007 Hall of Fame induction speech, Tony addressed the critics directly. He pointed out that his unconventional physique did not prevent him from reaching Cooperstown. He made it to the Hall of Fame despite all the jokes. Statistical analysis shows that Tony's weight may have cost him some defensive value. Researchers estimate that he lost about 38 runs in fielding performance over his career compared to what he might have achieved at a lighter weight, but his offensive production was virtually unaffected. He could still hit, he could still get on base, he could still win batting titles. The real cost of his weight was not on the field, it was in his joints. Tony underwent multiple surgeries on his knees and legs. The extra weight put strain on his body, especially given the demands of playing professional baseball for 2 decades. But even that is a relatively normal part of aging for athletes. The media's obsession with his weight became a dangerous distraction because it shifted the public's focus away from the serious health issues he was dealing with. By late 2010, Tony was in crisis. The cancer treatments had taken a toll. But there was another issue that was even more debilitating. Tony was suffering from severe disc problems in his back. These were not minor aches and pains. His spine was in such bad shape that he could barely move. At one point, Tony Gwynn, one of the greatest athletes in history, needed a walker just to get around. In a 2011 interview, he admitted that he was in bad shape. He said he was not doing a great job even with the walker. This was a 50-year-old man who should have been in the prime of his coaching career, and he could not walk on his own. But the media did not focus on that. They focused on how heavy he looked. They kept making the same tired jokes about his weight instead of recognizing that something was seriously wrong. The back issues and the mobility crisis were connected to his weight, but they were also connected to the cancer treatments and the toll that decades of professional athletics had taken on his body. Tony eventually lost a significant amount of weight. At one point, he lost so much that his clothes were falling off him. That weight loss finally gave him some relief from the back pain. He was able to walk again without assistance, but by that time, the cancer had already returned for the final time. The media's fixation on aesthetics robbed the public of the real story. Instead of understanding that Tony was fighting for his life, people saw him as a cautionary tale about fitness. Instead of recognizing the medical emergency, they saw a punchline. That misdirection meant that when Tony died in 2014, a lot of people were shocked. They had no idea how serious things had been because the media had spent years talking about everything except the truth. So now we have 3 separate lies. The tobacco industry lied about the safety of their product and targeted young black athletes to build a customer base before warnings were required. They knew the risks and hid them. They marketed addiction as a lifestyle choice. The Padres lied about the racist attack in their clubhouse and covered up a hate crime to avoid a scandal. They protected the perpetrator instead of the victim. They chose public relations over human dignity. The media lied by turning Tony's medical crisis into a story about his weight and his discipline. They made him a punchline instead of recognizing the emergency he was facing. These 3 lies existed independently for years. Each one was its own betrayal. Each one caused its own damage. But in the final chapter of Tony's life, they all came together. They converged into a perfect storm of deception that surrounded him from every angle. The tobacco addiction that was built in the 1970s led directly to the parotid gland cancer in 2010. That is a straight line. The habit that started in college killed him 35 years later. The toxic clubhouse environment that Tony endured in 1990 contributed to the psychological burden he carried throughout his career. That burden never went away. It shaped how he saw the organization and how he navigated his role as the face of the franchise. The media's focus on his appearance meant that the public never fully understood the scope of what he was dealing with. When he died, people were shocked because they had no idea how bad things had been. And all of it was happening while Tony was trying to live his life with grace and dignity. He was not hiding from the world. He was showing up every day, doing his job, being present for the people who needed him. After the cancer returned in 2012 and Tony underwent that brutal 14-hour surgery, he did not disappear. He kept coaching, he kept showing up for the game he loved, he kept mentoring young players at San Diego State University. He did all of that while dealing with facial paralysis, while waiting for his nerves to regrow, while managing the physical and emotional toll of fighting cancer. The legal fallout came after his death. In 2016, his family filed the wrongful death lawsuit against the tobacco companies. The lawsuit laid out the full scope of the industry's deception. It detailed the targeting of black athletes, the concealment of cancer risks, the marketing of smokeless tobacco as a safe alternative. It framed Tony's addiction not as a personal choice, but as the result of a calculated corporate scheme. The case went on for 2 years. During that time, the tobacco industry deployed the same defense strategies they always use. They argued that Tony was a sophisticated adult who knew the risks. They pointed to the warning labels that appeared in 1987. They tried to shift the blame onto Tony himself, but the family pushed back. They argued that by the time the warnings appeared, Tony was already addicted. They pointed to the industry's internal documents showing that they knew about the risks long before they were required to disclose them. They highlighted the racial targeting strategy that had made Tony a prime candidate for lifelong addiction. In 2018, the case was settled confidentially. We will never know the exact terms of the settlement. We will never know how much the tobacco companies paid or what conditions were attached. Confidential settlements are designed to protect the companies from public scrutiny. They prevent internal documents from being aired in court. They allow the industry to move on without admitting fault. But even though the settlement was confidential, it still mattered. It forced the tobacco industry to reckon with the consequences of their actions. It put the issue of smokeless tobacco back into the national conversation, and it contributed contributed to the cultural shift that led to Major League Baseball banning smokeless tobacco for new players in 2016. That ban was a direct response to cases like Tony's. The league recognized that allowing young players to use smokeless tobacco was enabling a deadly addiction. The ban does not apply to players who were already in the league before 2016, but it sends a clear message to the next generation. The dip culture that defined baseball for decades is finally being phased out. Here is what people need to understand. Tony Gwynn was not a victim in the traditional sense. He was not passive. He was not helpless. He was not someone things happened to without any agency or response. He was a man of immense strength and resilience who fought through circumstances that would have broken most people. The lies that surrounded his life did not define him. They did not determine who he was or what he accomplished, but they did shape the conditions he had to navigate. They created the landscape he had to cross. The tobacco industry created the addiction that led to his cancer. That addiction was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy to hook young athletes before they understood the risks. The Padres organization failed to protect him from racial intimidation. They chose institutional harmony over individual justice. They let a hate crime go unpunished because holding someone accountable would have been messy and uncomfortable. The media distracted the public from the real crisis. They turned a medical emergency into a story about weight and discipline. They made jokes instead of asking questions. And through all of that, Tony kept going. He kept being Mr. Padre. He kept being the face of the franchise. He kept being the mentor and the role model. He showed up to the ballpark. He coached young players. He signed autographs. He smiled for the cameras even when half his face could not smile back. He did not let the lies destroy his legacy. He built his legacy in spite of them, but the lies did cost him his life. That is the truth that needs to be told. That is the truth that cannot be buried under feel-good stories about loyalty and perseverance. Tony Gwynn died because a corporation lied to him about safety. He suffered because an organization lied about racism. He was misunderstood because the media lied about what was really happening. Those are facts. They are not opinions. They are not exaggerations. They are the documented reality of what happened. The goal here is not to tear Tony down. It is not to rewrite his story as a tragedy. It is not to diminish his accomplishments or turn him into a cautionary tale. The goal is to name the systems that failed him, the corporate greed that prioritized profit over health, the institutional silence that allowed racism to go unchecked, the media culture that valued aesthetics over substance. Those systems are still in place. They are still affecting athletes today. They are still creating the conditions where people get hurt and the truth gets buried. The only way to change them is to shine a light on what they did to people like Tony Gwynn. His story is not just about baseball. It is about accountability. It is about the cost of deception. It is about the price that real people pay when corporations lie, when organizations cover up, when media outlets chase clicks instead of truth. And it is about the resilience of a man who faced it all with more grace than anyone had a right to expect. Tony Gwynn could have been angry. He could have been bitter. He could have spent his final years fighting with the Padres or suing the tobacco companies or calling out the media for their treatment of him. Instead, he focused on the game. He focused on the next generation. He kept coaching. He kept mentoring. He kept showing up, even when his face was paralyzed, even when he needed a walker, even when the cancer came back and he knew his time was running out. He kept being the person he had always been, warm, generous, present. That is who Tony Gwynn was. Not despite the lies, but alongside them. The lies existed. They caused real harm. They shortened his life, but they did not define his character. His character was defined by how he responded to them, by the grace he showed in the face of injustice, by the strength he demonstrated in the face of suffering, by the commitment he maintained to being a good man even when the world around him was not being good to him. If this story mattered to you, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know what you think. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tony Gwynn's legacy is not just in his stats. It is not just in his 8 batting titles or his 338 career average. It is in the changes his suffering helped create. It is in the ban on smokeless tobacco that protects young players today. It is in the conversations about racism in sports that his story forces us to have. It is in the reminder that behind every statistic is a human being with struggles and pain and dignity. And that legacy deserves to be remembered. Not the sanitized version, not the feel-good story, the real version, the complete version, the version that includes the lies and the suffering and the grace, because that is the version that honors who Tony Gwynn actually was. Not a perfect hero, not a tragic victim, but a real person who navigated a broken system with more integrity than the system ever showed him. That is the story worth telling. That is the legacy worth protecting.